I'm not sure exactly how popular a take this will be with my particular audience, but I hope that you'll hear my argument out to its conclusion in hopes of adding a little more nuance to the overall discussion. But anime tourism has always been a thing and always will be. Now, I want to start by making a clear distinction between two kinds of anime tourists. The first of which is a person who gets into anime for a specific subset of series or genre based on what they already like in other mediums, after which they eventually exhaust that particular subset of shows and essentially leave the medium altogether. I want to make a clear distinction between that and, of course, the kind of anime tourist which seeks to aggressively change what anime is. The kind of person who doesn't necessarily really like anime, they like particular anime that are the exception to what the medium is, generally speaking, and they also like this idea in their mind of what anime could be if they could, essentially force their particular ideals onto Japanese creators and make them make the kinds of things that they want. At least for the majority of this discussion, I'm going to be referring to anime tourism in the most literal sense of the word tourism. People who come to anime for a specific subset of things, they exhaust what they're particularly interested in, and then they either leave completely or leave with exception to occasionally coming back and revisiting their particular favorites within that particular subset of things that they're particularly interested in. Oh yeah, I totally forgot to bring this up in the original recording, but I'm sure you can imagine how there might be some clear overlap between these two groups, but hopefully it's obvious that it's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. So part of this theory of mine stems from the fact that there has kind of always been this running gag traditionally in otaku culture online and anime forums and like, this idea that the quote-unquote life cycle of an anime fan is about 2 years, and the idea is that it takes about 2 years for an anime fan who isn't necessarily into the medium in a broader sense, who doesn't have an affinity for all of the weird stuff in the medium. It takes them probably about 2 years to exhaust the stuff that they're really interested in and are able to filter out with the tools available to them. And once they exhaust that, given about 2 years, they basically leave the medium. So the most obvious example of this would be the subset of people who get into anime specifically looking for the sort of stuff that they're traditionally used to in TV and Hollywood cinema. Shows that meet traditional standards and are like quote-unquote conventionally good. I think the most obvious clear-cut version of this would be people who get into anime after discovering that there are in fact anime that are like television and like cinema. So you have your sort of prototypical anime viewer who gets into the medium through Cowboy Bebop, for example. Then they decide to check out the rest of Shinichiro Watanabe's works. They, more than likely go watch Samurai Champloo, then decide to broaden their horizons a little bit, check out Serial Experiments Lane, maybe by way of that get into Technolize or Haibane Rinmei if they go really deep into that part of things. Then perhaps from that point they spread out to things like Monster, Berserk, Ghost in the Shell. They discover Ghibli movies and maybe Satoshi Kon's works, and then by way of this process go through all of the works that meet traditional standards that are conventionally good in the way that, like traditional Hollywood cinema is conventionally good. They eventually either exhaust all of these works or exhaust all of the ones that they are able to find through the filtering tools that are available to them. And then at some point when they find themselves sort of lost in the miasma of weird anime stuff, they decide that, they've basically consumed everything within the medium that is particularly interesting to them based on the stuff that they were already interested in in other mediums, television, Hollywood cinema, etc. I want to make it clear, obviously, that once again, there should be a clear distinction between this and people who like aggressively want to change the medium. I think it's totally fine for people to just exhaust all of the stuff within the medium of anime that they like in the same way that they like other things, and then get out and, go back to rewatching The Sopranos or whatever it is people do. But I think this is sort of the prototypical idea of a person who gets into anime, particularly for things that remind them of what they like in other mediums, and then eventually exhaust that and get out, probably only really revisiting their favorite works within the medium occasionally. But you can imagine other versions of this. Obviously, I'm sure there are people who get into anime through science fiction and, probably pretty quickly exhaust that one, since there aren't that many great, well heralded science fiction shows. But you could imagine the same thing for people who get into the medium specifically for fantasy shows and go through exhausting fantasy shows in particular. You could imagine the sort of person who gets into anime because they like military movies and police procedurals, and then after they go through all of the mech shows, which are kind of these war dramas, and they go through all of the police procedurals like Ghost in the Shell, Psycho-Pass, etc., they once again exhaust the sort of stuff that they were already interested in. Another example of this, which might be more prevalent, but which I do think is a little bit different, I would split into two particular categories. One being just, the prototypical shonen bro, and the other half of this group being, let's just call them a normie for simplification's sake, but obviously the kind of person who would consume basically shonen action shows, the more wholesome romantic comedies, and maybe some of the more normal isekai shows, and at the point which they've exhausted all of the most, classically heralded ones that they're really gonna like, they either exhaust what they're interested in and get bored of the medium and go back to what they were watching before, or they sort of fall into the groove of, I would guess this is potentially the prototypical Crunchyroll subscriber who sticks around just often enough to watch the 2 or 3 big new shonen fighting shows, as in, whatever the new JJK or Demon Slayer or Solo Leveling of the season is. And other than that, probably basically once again just watch an isekai here and there. The more wholesome romantic comedies, the ones that lack all of the fan service and depend on tropes a bit less, and possibly once again like isekai and maybe sports anime in particular, perhaps. And this would be, kind of the definition of the casual anime viewer who just kind of consumes the most mainstream sort of surface level appeal stuff within anime. And you could see how each of these different subsets is particularly distinctive, not just in the fact that they don't necessarily appreciate or have an affinity for anime as a broader medium, and possibly, of course, how they might not have an affinity for the tropes, the fan service, the Japanese references, the offensive humor, etc., the unhinged, unfiltered, miasma of weird anime stuff, as people often refer to it as. And once again, at risk of repeating myself, I would say, obviously, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with getting into the medium, consuming what you're particularly interested in, and then kind of just walking away from it. Obviously, I don't think there's anything quote-unquote toxic or, bad for the medium or online fandom or whatever it might be. It's just important to make a distinction between this as anime tourism and, once again, the type of person who aggressively wants to change the medium itself and throw a wrench into traditional online fandoms with people who really do have an affinity for the medium as a whole, broadly speaking. People such as myself who like the shonen action shows, like the rom-coms, whether they're wholesome or totally offensive and degenerate, who like the slice of life shows, the mech shows, the isekai, the yashike, the power fantasies, the comedy, the blah 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 to go on endlessly naming all of the different genres and subgenres. But once again, all of this is to say that this is very much not causal but partially correlated with anime tourism as a whole, but also sort of illustrates how it has always been a part of the medium and the fandom. Oh right, there was one more thing that I wanted to pull up and show here, but for some reason I'm locked out of my X account at the moment and can't search their posts. But I saw this post a little while back by the Weeb Crew. It was a screenshot of like a 17-year-old email. I think it was between like two translators, or a translator and a Comic-Con host or something like that. I don't remember, but it was this old ass email chain between these two, and they were arguing about fan service and localization and all this same stuff. And it really took me back to back in the day anime forums, including I think I saw some of these back in the day when Crunchyroll was still a piracy site. People in these forums arguing about the existence of fan service, as well as, of course, like what kind of fan service is better, like the subtle kind or the overt kind, and all this kind of stuff. And it just, once again, it reminded me that these arguments have been going on for a long time. They just weren't happening on one of the largest modern social media platforms of all time back when we were coming up. Anyway, back to whatever I was talking about. That is not to say that I don't think there's been sort of a parabolic explosion and a perspective shift. Obviously, the explosion could easily be tied to the COVID boom and the growth of Crunchyroll sort of going parabolic since that boom. I've seen a chart that Otaku Spirit put together about this. If I find that, I'll throw it on screen so that you can look at that.
The company revealed the paid subscribers for anime streaming service Crunchyroll surpassed 21 million as of the end of March 2026. Again, this is massive. I had like a chart that I made at some point that kind of shows their growth. Yeah, right here. You can see like for the longest time they were barely breaking like 1 million. And of course we had the whole COVID thing happened. And yes, we all talk about the fact that anime kind of boomed when COVID happened. Like we had an influx of people coming in here, which obviously a lot of people don't like. We have a lot of people that don't like all things about anime and they constantly bitch about things about anime. But yeah, that's because of this right here. During the COVID period, a lot of people were stuck at home and a lot of people got introduced to anime, and it just boomed after that point. Absolutely skyrocketed after that point. And yes, it's continued to grow. Like right here, I have the last report in 2025 of like a little bit over 16 mil, and now we've hit 21 million. It's crazy how it's grown.
But also, obviously, that is in part not just due to the COVID boom and the growth of Sony Crunchyroll and their sort of consolidation of the medium and the industry, but also there have obviously been all of these hugely successful parabolic growth stories behind anime, like Demon Slayer, like JJK, like Solo Leveling, the exploding popularity of One Piece as it enters its final arcs, etc. Many such examples of that. I'm sure many of them are fairly obvious, but if you've ever looked at the number of, once again, like Crunchyroll reviews attached to all of the big new shonens, or even the trending lists on piracy sites, you see fairly similar results. And thanks to the massive growth of viewers who really are, once again, kind of mostly just into the sort of surface level mainstream appeal of anime that don't go into as much of the weird anime stuff, this phenomenon has obviously seemed to experience an exponential or parabolic growth. I also think part of what contributes to, once again, the perspective shift on this would be discussion on platforms like X or Twitter, where the algorithmic promotion and the money making oftentimes really does just come from starting arguments and starting flame wars about this kind of stuff. It kind of has to make you question how many of the people complaining about these things don't even watch anime to begin with. They're just kind of trying to start debates so that they can engagement farm. Obviously, some of this has slowly crept into YouTube as well, and you see all of the recent videos about the LARPing phenomenon within the anime community online.
There's certain shows that you'll see on almost everyone's 3x3 list, a certain type of 3x3 that I almost feel like is posturing, or it's like people are basing their 3x3 on what 9 shows will make them look the smartest and coolest. What 9 shows make you look like you have great taste, make you look like you are a seasoned veteran and you know your stuff.
There's gotta be some kind of parasite that infects a young person's brain that makes them incapable of watching anything old, no matter how much they may wind up liking it. And forget it if there isn't any color. These aesthetic anime accounts would much rather yearn for the past through shiny clips of Macros Plus then actually watch this shit.
I just think that this phenomenon, this issue, is often oversimplified. People often like to point to it as if it is strictly a generational thing or strictly a particular kind of demographic issue, or as if it is particularly like a political bias thing. You've always got, people on the right, quote unquote the right, and quote unquote the left arguing about these things. Oftentimes though, you see, and this is the most, maybe disappointing part, on both sides of this argument, you see, for example, lots of people arguing against censorship, but they end up arguing with each other instead of arguing against the act itself. So you kind of see how much of that feels artificial, I guess is the word. And once again, you have to wonder how many of these people are actually even watching anime. How many of them are actually even people? Like, how many of them are bots is another question that I would ask. And once again, all of this is not to say that I don't think that this is an issue. I've obviously made videos related to this, my quote-unquote modern anime fans shitpost, for example. But I felt like it was important to sit down and talk about this because I think even I've been guilty of oversimplifying this issue and making it seem like a particularly binary issue between one group and another or whatever. And I think that's a poor way of framing the issue. I don't think it's very helpful for the discussion or for pushing back on any of the negative ramifications of the phenomenon. But I'm probably spinning my wheels at this point. If there's anything else I think of, as usual, I'll probably just slot it in wherever it makes sense. But hopefully this has at least been an interesting discussion for you. I welcome anyone to drop, comments, extrapolations, or questions in the comment section below. This is something that I'm interested in hearing other people's perspectives on, wherever they're coming from. I don't really care. Whatever side of whatever argument, whatever goofy binary distinction on the internet you might be a part of. But yeah, I guess that's about it. Hopefully I've touched on everything that I meant to. This has obviously been something that's, been worming around in my head for a while. But yeah, I guess that's about all. And peace as always.